In the tranquil neighborhoods of Oakland Hills, California, Hans Reiser's imposing home stood as a monument to his success. A brilliant software engineer, Hans was known for creating the Reiser FS, a revolutionary file system. But behind the polished facade of his career lay a fractured family life. His estranged wife, Nina Reiser, had sought refuge from his controlling behavior. Nina, a vibrant Russian immigrant, had come to the U.S. hoping for a new life, but instead found herself navigating a tumultuous marriage. That day, Nina prepared to drop their two children off at Hans's home for his visitation weekend. Before leaving, she had a brief conversation with her best friend, Beverly Palmer. "I know Hans is difficult," Beverly said cautiously, "but please be careful. He's not stable lately." Nina smiled faintly, brushing aside Beverly's concerns. "I'll be fine," she replied. "Hans wouldn't hurt me. He loves the kids too much." As Nina drove away, Beverly couldn't shake a lingering unease. The sunlit streets of Oakland Hills seemed peaceful, yet an air of tension brewed beneath the surface. Later that evening, a neighbor, Mr. Jeffries, observed an unusual scene from his window. Nina's car was parked outside Hans's house, but instead of the usual cordial exchange, he noticed a heated argument. Hans gestured wildly, while Nina appeared composed but firm. The neighbor didn't think much of it at the time. Domestic disputes weren't uncommon. Still, something about Hans's aggression unsettled him. By nightfall, Nina's car was gone, and the house stood eerily quiet. The children were inside, but Nina wasn't seen leaving. Hans, however, was spotted hours later, emerging from the garage and loading a large, indistinct bag into his car. He glanced around cautiously before driving off into the darkness. This fleeting moment etched itself into the back of Jeffries' mind, though he had no idea how significant it would become. The next morning, Beverly grew alarmed when Nina failed to respond to her messages. It was unlike Nina to go silent, especially with the kids at Hans's place. "Have you heard from Nina?" Beverly texted Hans, her fingers trembling. Hours passed without a reply. By midday, Beverly contacted the police. She recounted Nina's concerns about Hans's behavior and her insistence on going to his home alone. Her voice quavered as she concluded, "I warned her, but she thought she could handle it." The police arrived at Hans's residence for a welfare check. Detective Miller, seasoned and sharp-eyed, noted the pristine condition of Hans's house. "Too clean," he muttered under his breath. Hans greeted them with a calm demeanor, denying any knowledge of Nina's whereabouts. "She dropped the kids off and left. I assumed she'd gone home," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But Detective Miller wasn't convinced. As he stepped outside, he glanced back at the house and then to the garage. Something didn't add up. The morning after Nina's last known visit to Hans's home, Beverly Palmer's unease intensified. Calls to Nina's phone went unanswered. By mid-afternoon, Beverly, frantic, contacted the Oakland Police Department, recounting Nina's concerns about her estranged husband. "She said she'd only stay long enough to drop off the kids," Beverly explained, her voice breaking. "She promised to call me right after." Detective Miller and his team conducted a welfare check at Hans's residence. Hans greeted them with a practiced calmness. "She left," he stated plainly, standing in his meticulously tidy living room. "We exchanged a few words about the kids, and she drove off." Detective Miller's instincts bristled. Something was off. The house was too pristine, the answers too rehearsed. Meanwhile, Beverly, unable to sit idle, canvassed nearby neighbors. Mr. Jeffries recalled seeing Nina arrive the previous evening. "There was a lot of shouting," he said hesitantly, "but it didn't seem serious." Then pausing, he added, "I did see Hans later that night, though. He was loading something into his car. It looked like a large bag." This revelation shifted the tone of the investigation. Detective Miller returned to Hans with pointed questions. "Mr. Reiser," he began, "we've had reports placing you outside late last night with a suspicious item. Can you explain that?" Hans smirked faintly, his composure unwavering. "I was taking out some old equipment for work. Nothing illegal about that, Detective." But Hans's behavior grew increasingly erratic in the following days. He avoided follow-up inquiries and declined voluntary interviews. Then came the most damning act. Hans sold his BMW, the very car neighbors had seen him load the bag into just days after Nina's disappearance. Detective Miller, now convinced of Hans's involvement, secured a search warrant. In the driveway, Hans watched impassively as officers combed through his home and property. Inside the garage, they found faint traces of what appeared to be bloodstains. A neighbor's security camera captured Hans scrubbing his driveway in the early hours of the morning after Nina's visit. Still, Hans maintained his innocence. "I'm being harassed because I'm different," he told reporters when the story hit the local news. Nina's family held a tearful press conference. "She would never abandon her children," her mother said, clutching a photograph of Nina with her two young children. "We just want her back." Behind the scenes, tension mounted as detectives pieced together fragments of Nina's last moments. The blood traces were sent for analysis, and witnesses were re-interviewed. An anonymous caller tipped off the police, claiming Hans had been seen driving toward a wooded area days earlier. "You need to look closer," the caller urged. The evidence was mounting, but without a confession or solid proof of Nina's whereabouts, Detective Miller knew the case was hanging by a thread. As the sun set on Oakland Hills, Beverly sat alone, scrolling through old photos of Nina and her children, whispering softly, "Where are you, Nina?" Detective Miller stood in the driveway of Hans Reiser's Oakland Hills home, scanning the area with practiced precision. His gut told him there was more to Nina's disappearance than Hans was letting on. Back at the station, the lab results confirmed his suspicions. Traces of Nina's blood had been found in the BMW Hans sold just days after she vanished. Miller's jaw tightened as he examined the report. This was no coincidence. "Bring him back in," Miller ordered his team. They needed answers, and Hans wasn't going to talk freely. In the meantime, they expanded the investigation, re-interviewing neighbors and cross-referencing timelines. One statement stood out. Mr. Jeffries, the neighbor who had seen Hans late at night, now remembered an additional detail. "He was wearing gloves," Jeffries said, furrowing his brow. "It struck me as odd given it wasn't that cold." Miller couldn't shake the image of Hans, calm and collected, offering his carefully crafted alibi. "She left," Hans had said, his tone so nonchalant it bordered on eerie. But the evidence told a different story. With a search warrant in hand, the detectives combed through Hans's house and garage. It was pristine, almost unnaturally so. In the trash, they found receipts for cleaning supplies and a brand new shovel, purchased just 2 days before Nina went missing. Beverly Palmer, Nina's closest friend, was relentless in her efforts to keep the case alive in the media. "Nina wouldn't just disappear," she told reporters. "She lived for her children. Something's wrong, and Hans knows more than he's saying." Her tearful plea resonated, stirring public outcry and putting additional pressure on the investigation. While Hans continued to maintain his innocence, his behavior began to unravel. Surveillance footage obtained from a local hardware store showed Hans purchasing heavy-duty trash bags and duct tape. The timestamp matched the day after Nina's disappearance. "I was cleaning out old equipment," Hans explained dismissively when confronted with the footage. Miller's response was sharp. "Cleaning out what, Hans? Your wife's car? Your wife's life?" As the walls closed in, Hans became more elusive, refusing additional interviews and speaking through his lawyer. But Miller wasn't giving up. Late one night, he received an anonymous tip from a caller with a strained voice. "Check the wooded area off Skyline Boulevard," the caller said. "You'll find what you're looking for." With dawn breaking over Oakland Hills, the investigation reached a critical juncture. Miller knew they were closer to the truth, but Hans wasn't going to make it easy. As the team prepared for the next steps, Miller's determination burned brighter than ever. "We'll find her," he whispered to himself, "and we'll find justice." The case of Nina Reiser's disappearance became a media sensation almost overnight. Local news stations ran her smiling photo alongside headlines like "Mother of Two Vanishes" and "Husband's Silence Raises Questions." In living rooms across Oakland, families tuned in, debating whether Hans Reiser, the tech genius, was guilty of a heinous crime or the victim of unfounded accusations. Outside Hans's home, reporters and cameramen crowded the cul-de-sac, their cameras trained on every movement. Hans finally stepped outside, his sharp features etched with frustration. Clad in a crisp shirt, he addressed the crowd. "This is ridiculous," he began, his voice calm but tinged with annoyance. "I loved Nina. I had no reason to harm her. She left that night, and I haven't seen her since." But his words did little to quell public suspicion. Inside their homes, viewers scrutinized his every gesture. "Did you see the way he avoided eye contact?" one woman asked her husband. Another neighbor commented to a reporter, "He's always been strange, but I never thought this." Nina's family held their own press conference at a small church flanked by her two children. Her mother clutched a framed photo of Nina. Tears welled in her eyes as she pleaded, "We just want her home. Please, if anyone knows anything, come forward. Beverly Palmer, Nina's best friend, took the microphone next. Her voice cracked with emotion. Nina was afraid, she said, pausing to compose herself. She told me she didn't feel safe around Hans, but she still believed in his love for their kids. She wanted to make things work for their sake. Then came a shocking revelation. A former colleague of Hans, speaking anonymously, shared a chilling anecdote with reporters. He had these outbursts, the coworker revealed. Once, during a stressful project, he smashed a keyboard and shouted that he hated when people crossed him. It's not hard to imagine him snapping. The police, meanwhile, kept tight-lipped about their findings, adding to the growing speculation. Detective Miller, speaking briefly to the press, said only, "We are pursuing all leads and hope to bring clarity to this case soon." Social media erupted with theories. Amateur sleuths dissected Hans's demeanor, while others speculated about Nina's past. Rumors swirled about hidden affairs, secret bank accounts, and Hans's eccentric personality. Some painted him as a misunderstood genius, others labeled him a monster. The public's interest peaked when an investigative reporter unearthed court documents from the couple's contentious custody battle. In one filing, Nina had accused Hans of being unpredictable and controlling. Hans had countered, claiming Nina was irresponsible and manipulative. These details only fueled the narrative of a toxic, volatile relationship. Despite Hans's attempts to control the narrative, doubts continued to mount. When asked directly by a reporter if he would take a lie detector test, Hans smirked and replied, "Why would I? The truth doesn't need proving." By the end of the week, the case had become more than a local mystery. It was a national spectacle. Yet amidst the noise, one question remained unanswered. Where was Nina? For Detective Miller and his team, the clock was ticking, and the spotlight was only growing brighter. Detective Miller sat in the dimly lit evidence room, sifting through a mountain of reports. His team had made progress, crucial progress. Lab results confirmed that the blood found in Hans Reiser's BMW matched Nina's. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was something far darker. Earlier that day, Miller and his partner, Detective Harris, had confronted Hans with the forensic findings. Hans, always composed, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Blood?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nina cut herself all the time. She was clumsy." Miller studied Hans closely, the arrogance, the deflection. But there was something else, a flicker of fear behind his calculated mask. The detectives weren't buying his excuses. They knew Hans's meticulous nature. Nina's blood in his car wasn't an accident. And Hans's decision to sell the BMW immediately after her disappearance was a glaring red flag. But Hans had an explanation for that too. "I needed the money. Divorce isn't cheap." The investigation took a turn when detectives discovered another piece of damning evidence. Hans had purchased a large tarp and heavy-duty gloves at a hardware store the day after Nina went missing. The receipt, crumpled but legible, was retrieved from his kitchen trash. Miller's mind raced as he pieced together the timeline. Hans had prepared. He wasn't panicking, he was planning. Beverly Palmer, Nina's best friend, remained an unyielding advocate. She urged detectives not to lose sight of Nina's fears. "She told me Hans was capable of anything if he felt cornered," Beverly said during another interview. Her words lingered in Miller's mind as he drove past the dense wooded areas lining Skyline Boulevard. Later that week, an anonymous tip came through to the station. The caller spoke in a hushed tone, their voice trembling. "I saw his car. It was parked near the trailhead. It wasn't normal for him to be there. You need to check it out." Acting on the tip, Miller dispatched a team to comb the area. It was a daunting task. The woods were vast and dense. But Miller had a feeling this was it. This was the break they needed. "We're close," he muttered to himself as the search team disappeared into the trees. Back at the station, Hans was called in for another round of questioning. This time, his confidence wavered. Miller placed the tarp receipt on the table, letting the silence stretch. Hans's jaw tightened. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice low. "I needed it for a project." Miller leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "A project? Like cleaning up after your wife? Like hiding her from her children, her friends, her family?" Hans didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. As the search in the woods intensified, Miller stayed focused on building his case. Each piece of evidence brought them closer to the truth. Nina's voice, though silenced, spoke through the trail of clues Hans had left behind, and Miller was determined to ensure that her story would be heard. The interrogation room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Hans Reiser sat at the cold metal table, his hands folded neatly. Detective Miller stood across from him, his gaze unwavering. Between them lay a series of damning photos, Nina's bloodstains, the tarp receipt, and a GPS map showing Hans's car parked near a wooded area the night Nina disappeared. Hans picked up one of the photos and studied it. "You think this proves anything?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with irritation. Miller didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang, knowing that Hans hated losing control of the conversation. "It proves you're lying," Miller finally said, sliding another photo closer. "You were there. The question is, why?" Hans leaned back, his composure faltering for the first time. "I told you, I was clearing out old equipment, that's it." But his voice lacked the confidence it once had. Miller seized the moment. "Equipment or evidence, Hans? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were clearing out your mistakes." The tension in the room was thick. Hans shifted in his chair, his usual smirk replaced by a clenched jaw. He glared at Miller but said nothing. It was a game of endurance now. Who would break first? Meanwhile, Detective Harris observed through the one-way glass. "He's cracking," she whispered to a colleague. "He's not as invincible as he wants us to think." Harris had spent hours reviewing Hans's background, his controlling nature, his outbursts during the custody battle, and his growing desperation as Nina fought for full custody of the children. Hans wasn't just a suspect. He was a man on the verge of unraveling. Miller pulled out a photo of Nina's children. "They're waiting for their mom to come home," he said softly, his tone shifting. "What do I tell them, Hans? That their father didn't care enough to tell the truth?" Hans's reaction was immediate. His hands tightened into fists, and for a split second his facade crumbled. "Don't talk about my kids," he snapped, his voice low and sharp. Miller leaned in. "Why not, Hans? Because you know you've already failed them?" The psychological play was working. Hans's breathing quickened, and his gaze darted around the room. I didn't hurt her," he stammered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Harris stepped into the room, a tablet in hand. "Hans, we've got the GPS data. We know where you went that night." Hans froze. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. "I want my lawyer," he said abruptly, his voice cold and flat. Miller exchanged a glance with Harris before gathering the evidence from the table. "You can call whoever you want, Hans, but this isn't going away." As Hans was led back to his cell, Miller turned to Harris. "We've got him in a corner," he said, "but we need more. He's not going to break without a fight." Outside the station, the search team scoured the wooded area near Skyline Boulevard. Every step felt like a race against time, a desperate attempt to uncover the truth before it slipped through their fingers. Miller knew that Hans was hiding something he wasn't ready to admit. But the clock was ticking, and Nina's voice demanded justice. The search near Skyline Boulevard began at dawn. Officers combed through dense thickets, scanning every inch for signs of Nina. Detective Miller stood at the command post, his eyes glued to the GPS map showing Hans' movements the night Nina disappeared. "He was here for a reason," Miller muttered. "We just need to figure out why." Hours into the search, a patrolman radioed in. "We found something," he said, his voice tense. Miller rushed to the scene, where a set of tire tracks led to a secluded clearing. Nearby, they discovered partially buried trash bags. Inside were clothing items, duct tape, and a woman's scarf, unmistakably Nina's. Back at the station, the evidence was laid out in stark detail. Miller reviewed the footage of Hans at the hardware store, purchasing the items now tied directly to the case. Each piece was a nail in the coffin of Hans's alibi. "He planned this," Miller said grimly. "This wasn't impulsive." Meanwhile, Hans remained stoic during his arrest. "You're making a mistake," he said as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "This isn't what you think it is." But his confidence faltered when Beverly Palmer appeared on camera, clutching Nina's scarf. "She was my best friend," Beverly said through tears. "She didn't deserve this." The media frenzy intensified as Hans was formally charged with Nina's murder. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding justice. Hans, flanked by his lawyer, refused to answer reporters' questions. But his cryptic remark as he entered the building sent shivers through the crowd. "You'll never find her without me." Inside, Miller and his team pored over Hans's journals, seized during the search of his home. The entries painted a chilling picture of a man consumed by control and paranoia. One line stood out: "If I can't have them, no one will." It was damning, but not definitive. They still needed a confession, or Nina's body. Hans's lawyer filed motions to suppress the evidence, arguing procedural errors during the search. But Miller wasn't deterred. "We have him," he assured Harris. "We just need to push harder." In a calculated move, Miller arranged for Hans to see photos of Nina's children during questioning. "They miss their mom," he said softly. "Do you want them to grow up never knowing what happened to her?" Hans flinched, but remained silent. His lawyer cut the session short, but the crack in Hans's armor was clear. The pressure on Hans grew unbearable when the district attorney announced they would pursue the maximum sentence. "This case is about justice for Nina and her family," the DA declared during a press conference. "We will not rest until the truth is fully revealed." As the chapter closed, Miller stared at the evidence board in his office, each pinned photo and note connecting like a web around Hans. "We're close," he said to himself. "Closer than he thinks." The air in the interrogation room was heavy, every passing second tightening the tension like a coiled spring. Hans Reiser sat across from Detective Miller, his composure frayed but not entirely broken. His lawyer had left moments earlier after an hours-long standoff in which Hans had refused to cooperate, but now he was alone, facing the growing mountain of evidence against him. Miller slid a series of photographs across the table. The tarp, the trash bags, the scarf, each piece meticulously tied to Hans. "These aren't just coincidences," Miller began, his voice low but firm. "This is a pattern, a plan." Hans didn't look up. His hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered finally, his voice barely audible. Miller leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Hans. "What didn't you mean, Hans? Speak." The room fell silent again. Then with a deep, shaky breath, Hans spoke. "She wouldn't stop," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and regret. "We were arguing about the kids, about everything. She said I was a failure as a father, that I didn't deserve them." Miller stayed silent, letting Hans's words spill out like a dam finally breaking. "I lost it," Hans admitted. "I grabbed her. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop." His eyes were wide, glazed over as though reliving the moment. "She fell. She wasn't moving. I panicked." "And then what?" Miller pressed, his tone cold, precise. Hans hesitated, his jaw tightening again. I put her in the car. I didn't know what to do," he whispered. "I drove to the woods." Miller pushed a map toward Hans, a red circle marking the area near Skyline Boulevard. "Here?" he asked. Hans nodded slowly. "I buried her. I thought no one would ever find her." The room was suffocatingly still. Miller straightened, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Hans, you've taken everything from her family, from her children. You need to tell us exactly where." For a moment, Hans said nothing. Then, as if all the resistance had drained out of him, he gave a faint nod. "I'll show you," he murmured. Hours later, Hans sat in the back of a police car, staring blankly out the window as it wound through the darkened streets toward the forest. A team of officers followed close behind. Hans remained eerily calm, his earlier breakdown replaced by a chilling indifference. As the car slowed near the trailhead, he pointed to a secluded path. "There," he said simply. Under the cover of darkness, officers began digging in the marked spot. Miller stood to the side, his heart pounding as the first shovelfuls of earth revealed what they had been searching for. Nina, her scarf, her wedding ring, her final resting place. As Hans was escorted back into custody, Miller's thoughts were heavy with the weight of the moment. Justice was coming for Nina, but at what cost? Her life had been stolen, her children left motherless, and no confession could ever truly make it right. The sun was beginning to rise as Detective Miller and his team stood at the edge of the forest near Skyline Boulevard. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of pine and earth. This was it, the place Hans had pointed to just hours earlier. Officers moved methodically, marking the area and starting to dig where Hans had indicated. The tension was palpable, every sound amplified in the stillness of the woods. After what felt like an eternity, a muffled shout came from one of the officers. "We've got something!" Miller rushed over, his heart pounding. Beneath the loose soil, they uncovered a shallow grave. The sight of a scarf, Nina's scarf, poked out from the dirt, a haunting reminder of her presence. Miller's throat tightened as the forensic team worked carefully, unearthing what they all feared to find, Nina's remains. Beverly Palmer arrived shortly after, her face pale and drawn. She had insisted on being there, despite Miller's warnings. When she saw Nina's scarf being gently lifted from the ground, she collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. She didn't deserve this, she whispered through her tears. She was so full of life, and now, she's just gone. The discovery was a turning point, but it wasn't the only one. Nearby, another officer called out, holding a tattered piece of cloth that had been buried separately. As they continued searching, more items surfaced, personal belongings of Nina's that didn't match what she had been wearing the night she disappeared. It was as if Hans had tried to erase every trace of her existence. For Miller, the additional items raised a chilling question. Had Hans planned more than he admitted? This wasn't just about rage, he murmured to himself. This was calculated. Back at the station, the evidence was catalogued meticulously. The scarf, the clothing, even traces of duct tape. All pieces of a puzzle that painted an unmistakable picture of premeditation. Yet, Hans remained eerily silent. "I told you where she was," he said flatly during a follow-up interview. "What more do you want?" But Miller wasn't done. He confronted Hans with the newly discovered items, pressing him for answers. "Why were these buried separately, Hans? What were you trying to hide?" Hans simply stared at the table, his expression unreadable. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. The woods themselves seemed to hold the weight of Nina's story. The quiet, once peaceful, now felt ominous. Every tree and shadow a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded there. Miller couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover, that Hans's confession was only the surface of a much deeper truth. As the day ended, Beverly stood alone near the forest's edge, clutching a photograph of Nina and her children. "This is where she was left," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But this isn't where her story ends." Miller couldn't agree more. The case wasn't over, not yet. Hans may have led them to Nina, but the lingering questions and his cryptic demeanor hinted at secrets yet to be revealed. For now, justice had taken one step forward, but the forest of secrets still loomed, waiting for its final chapter to be written. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their notepads poised to capture every word. In the center of it all sat Hans Reiser, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a stoic mask. The prosecution was ready to present its case, the culmination of months of tireless work by Detective Miller and his team. This wasn't just a trial, it was a battle for justice for Nina Reiser. The district attorney, a seasoned prosecutor named Evelyn Marks, began with a blistering opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she started, her voice steady but firm, "this case is about control, obsession, and the tragic consequences of a man who couldn't accept losing what he believed was his. Hans Reiser didn't just take Nina's life. He shattered a family, robbed 2 children of their mother, and thought he could get away with it." Hans's defense attorney, Robert Ellison, countered with a plea for understanding. "This is not a case of cold-blooded murder," he argued. "Hans Reiser is a brilliant man who made a tragic mistake in a moment of emotional turmoil. He didn't plan to kill Nina. This was a crime of passion, not premeditation." As the trial progressed, the prosecution unveiled its arsenal of evidence. Photos of the shallow grave where Nina's body was found were displayed on a large screen, eliciting gasps from the jury. "This," Mark said, pointing to the images, "is the reality of Hans Reiser's actions. A woman who trusted him, reduced to nothing more than a secret he tried to bury." Forensic experts testified about the bloodstains in Hans's car and the duct tape found near Nina's remains. They explained how the evidence tied Hans directly to the crime. Each detail chipped away at the defense's argument, leaving little room for doubt. Then came the emotional testimony. Nina's mother, her hands trembling as she clutched a photo of her daughter, spoke of the pain her family had endured. "Nina was my light," she said, her voice breaking. "Hans took her from us. He took her from her children." The courtroom fell silent as Beverly Palmer took the stand. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted Nina's fears in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. "She told me she didn't feel safe," Beverly said, her voice trembling, "but she wanted to believe Hans would never hurt her. She was wrong." Ellison tried to discredit the witnesses, painting Hans as a misunderstood genius whose quirks were being used against him. "My client isn't a monster," Ellison insisted. "He's a father, a man who loved his family, and someone who deserves compassion." But the prosecution had one final piece of evidence, emails between Hans and Nina. In them, Hans had written threats thinly veiled as pleas for reconciliation. "If you take the kids, there will be consequences," one email read. The jury visibly recoiled at the chilling words. As the trial neared its conclusion, the public outside grew restless. Protesters gathered with signs demanding justice for Nina, their voices echoing through the streets. Inside, the tension was palpable as the jury prepared to deliberate. Hans sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. He didn't look at the jury, nor did he react to the damning evidence presented against him. Whether it was guilt or defiance, no one could tell. The judge's voice rang out as she addressed the jury. You must decide if the actions of the accused were deliberate and calculated, or the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. The life of Nina Reiser and the justice she deserves depends on your decision. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. After weeks of testimony, emotional appeals, and meticulous evidence, the moment had finally arrived. The jury filed back into the room, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Hans Reiser sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, as Judge Martinez asked the foreman, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman replied, standing with a slight tremor in his voice. The clerk approached and took the paper, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. As she handed the verdict to the judge, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Hans Reiser," the foreman began, his voice firm now, "guilty of second-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the audience. Nina's mother let out a quiet sob, clutching Beverly Palmer's hand tightly. Hans sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The verdict was clear, but it seemed to wash over him without leaving a mark. He had shown no remorse throughout the trial, and this moment was no different. Judge Martinez called for order, then turned to address the court. "Hans Reiser, you have been convicted of the murder of Nina Reiser, a mother, a daughter, and a friend whose life was taken unjustly. This court sentences you to 15 years to life in prison." The words echoed in the chamber, final and unyielding. Hans's expression remained blank, but as he was led away in handcuffs, he turned to the gallery and muttered under his breath, "I only did what was necessary." The chilling statement sent a shiver through those who heard it, a haunting reminder of his calculated nature. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Nina and remember her name." Reporters clamored for comments, and Nina's mother stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "This verdict won't bring Nina back," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But it gives us some peace, knowing her children will grow up understanding that justice was served." Beverly added, "This isn't just about Nina. It's about every woman who has been silenced, every family left broken. We will honor Nina by making sure her story is never forgotten." As Hans was transported to the state penitentiary, Detective Miller stood in the courtroom, staring at the now empty defense table. "It's over," Harris said quietly, joining him. Miller nodded but didn't reply. Deep down, he knew the scars this case had left, on Nina's family, her children, and even himself, would never fully heal. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the trial lingered, haunting those who had witnessed it. For Nina Reiser's family, the verdict was a step toward closure, but the weight of her absence remained unbearable. Beverly Palmer stood outside the courthouse, her voice cracking as she addressed the cameras. "This isn't just about Nina," she said. "This is about every person silenced by someone who thought they had the right to control their life. We won't forget her." Nina's two children, now under the care of their grandparents, struggled to understand the loss of their mother. Photographs of happier days adorned the walls of their new home, Nina holding their hands at a park, reading to them before bedtime. Each picture was a reminder of a life stolen too soon. "She loved you so much," Nina's mother would whisper to them, her tears falling silently. Detective Miller, sitting in his dimly lit office, reflected on the months of relentless investigation. He stared at the evidence board, now stripped bare, and felt a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. "We got him," he murmured to himself, but the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought Nina back. Hans Reiser, now inmate #45,237, adjusted to life behind bars with the same detached arrogance he had displayed throughout the trial. Fellow inmates avoided him, sensing an air of cold calculation. In a rare interview with a journalist, Hans claimed, "They think they know everything, but they don't. There's always more to the story." His cryptic remarks sparked fresh speculation, but the legal case was closed, leaving no room for further investigation. Inspired by Nina's memory, Beverly launched the Nina Reiser Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence. The foundation's first fundraiser drew an overwhelming response, with community members rallying to ensure Nina's story would save others. Beverly, holding back tears, told the crowd, "This foundation isn't just for Nina. It's for everyone who needs a voice when they feel like they've lost theirs." In Oakland Hills, the forest where Nina was found had become an unofficial memorial. Flowers and notes lined the path, each one a testament to her impact. A single plaque engraved with her name stood as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of speaking out. The final chapter of Nina's life may have been written, but her legacy was just beginning. Her story, though tragic, served as a beacon for those fighting their own battles. And as her children grew, they carried with them the love and resilience their mother had instilled in them, ensuring that Nina's voice would never be truly silenced. What do you think of Hans Reiser and his shocking actions in this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories. Your support helps us bring you the stories that matter.